beginning of the First Macedonian War in 200 BC. In 201 BC, we see the end of the Second Punic War with Rome and Carthage. So at this point now, Rome has a free hand to do things that it wasn't otherwise able to do in the East. But in the intervening years, Philip is busy building his own Macedonian empire. So Ptolemy IV Philopater dies and is ascended to the throne by his 6-year-old son, Ptolemy V. Well, at this point, Antiochus the Great of the Seleucid Empire and Philip V attack and try to dismember as much of the Ptolemaic Empire as they can. From 204 to 201 BC, Philip consolidates gains in Thrace. In 201 BC, Philip invades Asia Minor and runs up against the Roman ally, Attalus I, king of Pergamum, and the Rhodians. But now the Rhodes is basically off the coast of what was antiquity called Caria, which is, I think, today in more modern times. Well, actually, it's got Turkish names now, but in ancient times, opposite Rhodes on the mainland was Smyrna. And so in the region of Caria and Pergamum, Philip is making territorial gains. He takes Samos and Miletus and burns temples outside the walls of Pergamum. He sends his fleet to Caria, but is blockaded at Bargilia by a combined Rhodian Pergamese fleet. Pergamum and Rhodes then ask Rome for assistance. Rome sends Marcus Valerius Labienus, who had led the Roman forces in the First Macedonian War, to investigate the situation to see if what was reported by the Pergamese and Rhodians was correct. Meanwhile, in Athens, they put to death 2 Acarnanians who had infiltrated the Temple of Demeter during the Eleusinian Mysteries. This led to a retaliatory attack by the Acarnanian League with the aid of the Macedonians. Rhodes and Pergamum persuade Athens to break with neutrality and join their war against Philip. So now Philip has 3 independent Greek states fighting against him. As well, Philip invades Attica with 2,000 foot and 200 horse, putting Athens to siege, destroying the region of Attica surrounding. Now, the Romans join this war in 200 BC. So Labienus returns, confirming the threat, and Rome declares war on Macedonia. This is under the consulship of Publius Sulpicius Galba and Gaius Aurelius Cotta. Sulpicius was designated commander in the Macedonian front. He marched troops to Brundisium to recruit veterans from the Second Punic War. Sulpicius lands at Apollonia and stations his fleet at Corcyra, which is basically a repeat of the Roman opening strategy of the First Macedonian War. Philip besieges Abydos, which is opposite in his Dardanelles campaign. I think Abydos is opposite the Dardanelles in Asia Minor. And he offers the city terms of surrender. The men kill the women and children, throw their riches into the sea, and swear an oath to fight to the death. At this point, Philip is met by a Roman ambassador, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, coming from Egypt, who says that Philip really ought to leave these Greek cities alone, and other free Greeks, or otherwise Rome might decide to intervene. And he says this is in breach of the Treaty of Phoeniki in 205 BC, but the Roman doesn't really care at this point. Philip eventually takes Abydos, but then he hears of the Romans landing in Epirus. Now, there's operations in Chalcis and Attica. Chalcis is in Euboea, opposite Attica. So Euboea is an island where in the Second Greco-Persian War, there's the Battle of Artemisium Strait, which takes place along the coastline of Boeotia and Euboea. So while the Athenians are under siege, they appeal to the Romans for aid, and from Corcyra, Caius Claudius Centho, with a fleet of 20 ships and 1,000 men, sailed to relieve them. The Macedonian commander Philocles retires from Attica to Corinth. Claudius reaches Chalcis, Euboea, which is one of the fetters of Greece, and sails in. Philip marches first to Euboea with 5,000 foot and 300 horse, but he finds the Romans have already left. Marching into Attica, Philip defeats an Athenian Pergamese force outside the Diplon Gate and camps at the Cynosagres. Philip destroys the temples and tombs in Attica, desecrating the dead and offending the gods from the point of view of the Athenians. Philip offers aid to the Achaeans in their war with Nabis, tyrant of Sparta, in return for support in his war with Rome, but realizing that that's really a treaty only in the favor of the Macedonians, to which the Achaeans have nothing to gain. They turn him down. With 2,000 troops, Philocles joins Philip and attempts to capture the Piraeus, which he fails to do. Philip continues to ravage Attica and returns to Boeotia. He sends his son Perseus to the Sar Mountains to prevent a juncture of the Romans and Dardanians. In order to prevent the naval bases of Peripathos, Skythos, and falling into Roman hands, he destroys them. Now, one of the things that we'll see here is that Philip has a tendency to destroy cities that he thinks might fall into Roman hands, which is a sort of scorched earth policy, which makes sense from a strategic point of view, but ends up being a diplomatic disaster, losing the support of most of the Greeks in future negotiations. Because one of the things that highlights this war is that there are a lot of negotiations that take place, unlike, say, in the Second Punic War or even the First Macedonian War. Philip and Flamininus are busy talking to each other, trying to find some sort of accommodation. And then in 200 to 199 BC, under Sulpicius and Villius, the Romans continue their pressure. So Sulpicius places a base at the mouth of the Samon River in Illyria. He sends Lucius Apustius to raid the western border of Macedonia, including the cities of Antipatria and Codrion. Diplomatic negotiations with the Illyrians under Scridulidius, the Dardanians under Bato, and Athamenes under Emenander lead to renewed alliances, all of which had been in place in the First Macedonian War. Philip, the Romans, and the Athenians all seek to sway the Aetolians to their side. In 199 BC, Sulpicius led his army into the territory of the Dacerati in Illyria, engaging in some inconclusive battles with Philip. And much of this was due to the rough terrain, which was not ideal for the deployment of their forces. Philip was nearly captured in one engagement. The Macedonians withdrew upon hearing an invasion by the Dardanians, withdrawing in the night. And this Dardanian threat, remember, is a persistent one for Macedon. Philip the second, father of Alexander, comes to power when the previous king of Macedon was killed by Dardanians. So, yeah, this is a problem that the Macedonians never really seem to ever figure out how to deal with. Sulpicius pursued through Pelagonia and drove the Macedonians from their positions holding the pass of Edoria. Sulpicius ravaged Edoria, Elamina to the south, and marched to the Halicameron River to Orestes, where he conquered Seletrum and Pelion. Sulpicius returned to his base at the Seaman River. Philip divided his forces, one to fight the Dardanians and one to march south. We also see combined naval operations, as we saw in the last Macedonian War with Rome and the Kingdom of Pergamum. The Roman fleet at Corcyra, under the command of Lucius Apustius, sails around the Peloponnesus to join King Attalus near Hermione. The combined fleet captures the base of Andros for Pergamum. The fleet sails further, supported by contingents from Issa and Rhodes, to Cassandria on the Chalkidiki Peninsula. That's the peninsula. Looks like it has three fingers pointing out into the Aegean Sea, which is a failure. And then they return to their home ports for winter. And then we have operations under Villius. So on March 15th, 999 BC, Villius replaces Sulpicius. He sails to Corcyra, and from there he faces the mutiny of 2,000 veterans from the Second Punic War. He tells them that the best way for them to get what they want, leave to go home, and since they've already served in the war against Carthage, is to work within proper channels and trust him to negotiate next time he goes to the Senate. So at that point, he basically diffuses the mutiny. Now, Philip camps on both sides of the river Aus upon a narrow ravine. At this point, Villius marches forward and camps, but does nothing because in short order he'll be replaced by Titus Quinticius Flamininus, who was sailing from Eubea to replace him. King Antiochus the Great was attacking the territories of Pergamum, which prevailed against Attalus from aiding Rome. In turn, and so Rome sends envoys to Antiochus to tell him to leave Attalus alone, which, given the prestige and power of Rome, and Antiochus, concerned with other conflicts in his kingdom, withdraws his forces. Now, also, since Flamininus has been recalled from Euboea, one of the things that was interesting about the Euboean campaign, from at least as it was under the control of Flamininus, was he besieged the city of Chrysistus, which was one of the few times where the Macedonians won an outright victory against the Romans. And Livy makes the point of saying that the phalanx formation, as long as it held, was impenetrable. So whenever the Romans would knock a hole in the wall with rams or moles, or sorry, not moles, mines, they would form their phalanx and drive the Romans out. And unable to find a break, the Romans decided to abandon the attack. So in this case, we see that as long as the Macedonian phalanx is in a tight formation, even the Romans have a hard time breaking through. So I think this is the campaign up until Titus Flamininus takes over. So any thoughts, terminal philosophy?
Right. Well, I think I just want to make a few quick comments on the broader geostrategic situation in 200 BC, and then after which I'll respond to your introduction. First, I think it should be stated that the Second Punic War was, in fact, still being waged in Iberia and Numidia by 200 BC. The most powerful empires, again, just as a retrospective, the most powerful empires and factions and kingdoms in the Mediterranean were the Romans, a defeated Carthage, which still retained a small amount of territory, which is comparable to the territory of modern Tunisia, Ptolemaic Egypt, who were very weakened due to internal issues, the Macedonians under Philip V, the Greek city-states in the Peloponnese, basically everything south of the Isthmus of Corinth, and then the Seleucid Empire to the east. Now, I think it's important to remember that, as you mentioned earlier, it's important to remember that Philip V led Macedonia, the Achaean League, Epirus, and several other smaller city-states to victory in the lesser-known Social War in 217, and that was against the Aetolian League and Sparta, which we previously covered. So, in three short years, Philip was still sort of riding high in the vibes of his victories, and was looking forward to what at that time appeared to be a probable trajectory of Macedonian domination of Greece more broadly. However, to the west, you've got Rome, which had begun to achieve huge victories against Hannibal, some of which culminated at the Battle of Zama in 202. So, despite the Romans dominating Iberia and reducing Carthaginian forces to basically a mere fraction of what they fielded in the early and middle stages of the Second Punic War, Philip decided to exploit the naked and evident weaknesses of Ptolemaic Egypt. So in 205, Egypt suffered a series of these horribly destabilizing revolts, which weakened the Ptolemaics, their dynastic rule over Upper Egypt, in which they eventually lost. And I believe that was a year later. And then in that same year of 205, Ptolemy IV died, which you had mentioned. He died basically a premature death and was succeeded by his 6-year-old son, Ptolemy V. Now, this was basically all that Philip needed to hear to start taking islands in the Aegean, which were under Ptolemaic rule, and several other Rhodian and Pergamese allies, and some of them were neutral as well. This is where I found some minor disagreements amongst historians concerning the sort of precise beginnings of the Second Macedonian War, because from 205 to 200, the Cretan War occurred between Macedon, her allies, and then against Rhodes, Pergamum, and its sort of coalition of smaller city-states and kingdoms. So, although the Rhodians and the Pergamese won the war and gained large swaths of territory in West Anatolia, Macedon, Philip still had great martial. They still had martial capability. So, and this was both on land and at sea. So, basically, it was a bad time to be in charge of Egypt by 205, because not only was Philip starting to take several Aegean islands, but the ruler of the Seleucid Empire, which is Antiochus III, he had returned from a successful campaign much further to the east, and he also quickly caught on to the decay of the Ptolemaic rule over Egypt. So this also basically materialized in the form of the Fifth Syrian Wars in 202, which were fought mostly in Coelia, Syria, and the island of Cyprus. So that means that Egypt was fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who had far more professional armies than they possessed or could even finance. With all this being taken into account, Philip started taking several of the Cyclades Islands, I think is pronounced, and started forming basically amicable relationships with these island populations with their smaller sort of city-states, and several more historical Hellenistic cities on the coast of Asia Minor. So this finally led to both Rhodes and Pergamum basically just they're fed up with this aggression, and they declared war on Philip. So this manifested in the battle, or rather the siege of Chios in 201, which Philip was victorious, and in part he decimated the Rhodian forces, and then from there he campaigned for the city of Pergamum itself, and there he basically successfully pounded the Pergamese forces outside the walls, but ultimately he didn't have the means of taking the city. From what I read, there just seems to be a lack of siege equipment, or perhaps even a diligent, experienced army who was capable of doing that, because he had a lot of mercenary forces involved as well. And again, he had a coalition himself. But Philip, and so I guess I'll just say before I get too much further, I'll address the Romans here, but just as a sort of a side note, I will say that, in studying this war, Philip is very, in terms of the traditions of great Macedonian commanders, and there's some exceptions, but they're, in the categories of tactics, strategy, and operations, he was often very impulsive and reactionary, and he just honestly showed a really barbaric treatment of the civilian populations of his enemies. For example, at the city, I think it's Abydos, which is right off the coast. It's just I forget the strait which that's called, that you enter the Black Sea into, but basically the entire population, or most of the population, committed suicide, just like a mass suicide, because they didn't want to live under Philip. So that kind of tells you a lot of what you need to know about Macedonian occupation of certain cities if you were on Philip's bad side. So that's, that as you mentioned this, you did it in a fairly eloquent way earlier, where this brutish and just barbaric tactics ultimately ends up costing him politically, and really weakens a lot of relations that he has. And then, of course, by 202, if I'm getting my years correct here, the Pergamese and the Rhodians basically contact Rome as a way of seeking help against their war with Philip. And that's basically what starts off the sort of the beginnings of the war. And then from there, you see the amphibious landings at Epidamnus and Oricum and Phoenice, and that's where Publius Galba lands his forces and starts campaigning east towards the river battle that's really the first battle before Cynocephalae, and that's where Philip suffers a bad defeat against the Roman legions.
Right. So the next phase here is the decisive phase of the war, where Titus Flamininus takes command. And what we see here is he takes command of Macedonia with 8,000 foot and 800 horse to continue the campaign against Philip. Now, when he arrives, he arrives at the Ouse Valley. He replaces Villius. The Romans encamp there for 40 days, seeking in part to negotiate. Flamininus offers peace terms with Philip. And what's interesting about these peace conferences is not only is it the Romans and Philip, it's also the other Greek states. So you'll see the Aetolians, you'll see the Achaeans, you'll see the Athenians, you'll see Pergamum. It's kind of this open forum and this is the first one that we see, and we'll see a couple more throughout this war. He says that the original demand was that Philip cease attacking the Greek states. To this demand, Flamininus adds that he withdraws Philip offers reparations to the Greeks harmed by Philip, withdrawing garrisons outside Macedonia, including Thessaly. Now, since Thessaly had been a part of the Macedonian kingdom since Philip II, this was seen as a completely unacceptable to Philip, who storms out in a rage. So Flamininus then continues the campaign. He finds, under the advice of a shepherd, a way to outflank the strong position that Philip has. And so he attacks the main line with his legions as a holding position, and then outflanks the Macedonians and drives them forward. And so they flee into, Philip flees to Tempe, and along the way, he destroys the city of Tricca. Again, this is Philip's habit of destroying cities. And in one of the negotiations, both Livy and Plutarch love to talk about these negotiations, but it's a little hard for me to figure out where they fit in the broader timeline of the wars, because they seem to be more character-driven, so they want to tell you what these characters were doing, which is, I mean, fine. That's what they're interested in. But one of the, this is what the Aetolians said to Philip, and I think this is probably, let's see, what time would this have been? Sometime before the Senate before Philip offers up his terms to the Senate a little bit later, where they take, I think it's in, 198, where they take winter quarters. But this is relevant since we've already read about Philip destroying cities. Phanius the Aetolian states, Philip was neither sincere at this present moment in proposing terms, nor bold in his manner of making war when he had to do that. In conferences and colloquies, he was always setting ambushes and lying in wait, and using all the practices of war, but in actual war itself took up a position at once unjust and ignoble. For he avoided meeting his enemies face to face, and he fled before them, employed himself in burning and plundering the cities, and by this policy, though himself beaten, he spoiled the value of the victor's reward. Yet former kings of Macedonia had not adopted this plan, but one exactly the reverse, for they are continually fighting with each other in the open field, but rarely destroyed and ruined cities. So what we see is that this war was really a diplomatic war as much as a military war. And we can argue that Philip lost from the beginning because the Romans had won the diplomatic game. They were able to muster, in part because Philip had made many enemies. He'd angered the Rhodians, the Pergames, the Athenians, but he'd also estranged his own allies, the Achaeans, which we'll get to a little bit later. And so what we see with Flamininus, and something that Plutarch mentions in his own biography of the man, is that he was extremely exceptional as a diplomat, able to unite all the Greeks against Philip, which gave him the sort of casus belli of being the liberator, which is a shrewd move. That's exactly how Philip and Alexander consolidated Greece and invaded Persia. So at this point, after the defeat at the Aus and the failed negotiations, the Aetolians launch attacks on Inus and Dolapia. King Anamander captures Gompi and Thessaly. Flamininus enters Epirus. The combined forces of Flamininus and Amanander entered Thessaly. These forces besieged Atrax unsuccessfully and eventually moved to Phocis. The combined forces captured Antikyra to secure supplies and lodgings for the winter. The Roman Athenian forces also captured Elatia. Naval operations, Titus's brother Lucius commanded the Roman fleet from Corcyra and sailed to Athens. There he joined Rhodian and Attalid naval contingents and sailed to Euboea, capturing Eretria. And then wintering, and then sailing to Kenchreia to besiege Corinth. The Romans were able to gain the support of the Achaean League. Initially, there was a negotiation where the Achaeans wavered, but seeing that Philip was in no position to help them against Nabis, king of Sparta, and that Philip himself was untrustworthy, they sided with Rome. Now, what's important here is this shows you the success of Roman diplomacy, or rather the failure of Philip's diplomacy, and that the Achaeans and Aetolians, who had been mortal enemies, as we'd seen in the Cleomenian War and the Social War, are now allies against Philip. So quite the reversal from what we've seen in the previous 10 years of conflict in the region. Philip instead then decides to negotiate with Nabis of Sparta. He's able to get a conspiracy to take over the city of Argos, which he then, or rather, we'll get to Argos in a minute. When the Achaeans decide to switch, Argos, Megalopolis, and Dyme do not join the alliance with Rome against Philip because they had long-standing treaties with Philip. But again, the loyalty of Argos is not rewarded because what Philip then does is give the city over to the Spartans under the tyrant Nabis. So it really shows you that Philip is a despicable figure and that Argos should have just joined the broader war against him with Rome, and that their loyalty to him wasn't rewarded at all, and that the overall Achaean decision to turn against them was more or less correct. But the Roman Achaean Pergames force besieging Corinth was defeated by the Macedonian general Philocles, who arrived from Boeotia. Elements within Argos invited Philocles in, from which he could then control the city and offer to Nabis. Now the issue here is that while on the main front, Titus and Philip, as we'll get to, Philip loses. Along the peripheral fronts early on in the war, Philocles is like Macedon's MVP. He's just getting all these victories against the allies of Rome against Macedon. And then here's the main winter negotiations. This is the winter of 198 BC. Philip basically refuses to disembark from the fleet onto the beach, claiming that he doesn't trust Flamininus, his Greek allies, and that he should like to send a delegation to the Senate directly, which the Romans agree to since winter is already coming and it's not fit for campaigning. The real sticking point here is that Rome wants Philip to leave what are called the fetters of Greece, 3 cities, one in Thessaly, Demetrius, one in Euboea, Chalcis, and one in Peloponnesus, Corinth. And these are considered the 3 points from which Macedon could control Greece. Now, Chalcis and Corinth, to my mind, are obvious. Corinth controls the isthmus of Corinth, which connects Peloponnesus to Attica, and Chalcis controls the Strait of Euboea. I'm not entirely sure what situation puts Demetrius in such a unique position. It apparently commands the plains of Thessaly, and of course he's not willing to give those up, not unless he has to. And so basically, it just sort of falls into negotiations in the Senate. I've already mentioned Nabis and the switcheroo, but then even Nabis double-crossed Philip because Nabis says, I'll make a treaty with Rome, stop attacking the Achaeans, and give Rome supplies. So really, faithless with all, no one has faith with Philip. And and then this is right before the Cynocephalite campaign. So what are your thoughts up to this point?
Right. Well, I have to, completely agree with you in the sense that this was a total diplomatic failure on the part of Philip, and really from the start, and that's why I mentioned earlier that there's some light debates as to when the beginning of the Second Macedonian War took place. I mean, you could argue that it took place in 200 with the landing of the Roman forces at Apollonia and as far north as Epidamnus. However, the circumstances that led up to that was just this Macedonian aggression pointed towards Ptolemaic Egypt with some of their holdings in the Aegean, and then even more so with the kingdom of Pergamum and the Rhodians. So already, the anti-Macedonian coalition is just gargantuan. You've got the Romans, you've got Pergamum, Rhodes, Athens, you even have Sparta, you have the Aetolian League, you have Apollonia, you have the Illyrians, you have Issa, the Boeotian League. And then as far as the belligerents for the Macedonians go, what's more broadly referred to as Antigonid Macedonia, and then you have the Boeotian League, which again did the switcheroo, as you mentioned, and then the Acarnanian League, Acarnanian League. Thank you. That's a bit of a tough one for me. But yeah, the math just doesn't work out for Philip. It's hard to speculate what the full ratio against him was as far as land and naval forces go, but it's probably at least 4-1, if not more. But I'm just giving a conservative estimate there. But yeah, as you mentioned earlier, as far as campaign specifics go, the Roman landing takes place in 200, and then of course you have really the first defeat, which is at the river crossing, which is at I think it's called the Ouse River, or yeah, it is the Ouse River, and in which basically Roman organization and Flaminius' forces, they basically take a mountain pass. You've got the Ouse River on the southern portion of the battlefield, and then Philip's forces are facing west towards the Roman formations. However, there was a mountain pass that basically flanked around the Macedonian formations that only left about several phalanxes to try and defend the encampment of the Macedonians, but they were ultimately crushed, and he ultimately had to flee to I can't remember the name of the city. It was I think I got it right here. Apologize. There's a lot of city names here. I think he had retreated to Pella, and then a lesser known battle in the north. And you have to remember that the Dardanians were also allies with Rome in the Second Macedonian War, and there were multiple sort of not successful battles on the part of the Dardanians, but basically these sort of containment battles that prevented Macedonian expansion any further north. They couldn't go into Thrace, they couldn't go into Dardania or into Illyria. They certainly couldn't attack Roman allies in Epirus and Epidaurus and Apollonia. So again, he's basically swarmed, and then also the naval ratio doesn't look great at all with the Romans basically taking control of the Isthmus of Corinth. And then the Rhodians, as I mentioned earlier in the Cretan War, they occupied most of Crete and most of the islands that are in the southwest portion of just off the coast of Asia Minor. So really, he got himself into trouble from the very beginning, just by, I mean, he was clueless as far as diplomacy goes. And with these failed raids in the south towards the Aetolian League's borders, with places like Larissa, which is near Cynocephalae, which we'll get to here in just a moment, as well as Demetrius. I mean, the Ouse River battle really set the tone for basically the remainder of the war, because he had no allies to derive mercenary forces or any sort of temporary forces. He didn't nearly have the population centers that both Rome and her allies had to recruit to replenish their ranks. So he just got himself onto such a bad start, and desecrating temples in Pergamese territory, and slaughtering thousands of Pergamese civilians. I mean, I guess this would just lead me to ask, like, what was he thinking, and what was he trying to accomplish by this? And based off of other commanders who show a bit more careful and sort of more pensive decision making, this is very un-Macedonian of Philip to be so borderline Neo-Babylonian, if you don't mind the expression. But they're just as a quick recap, there were containment raids sent by Dardania. You of course have the Romans marching east in 199 and going as far south to Dodona, and then this basically sets up. I don't want to call it. When you look at battlefield maps, especially maps of like World War II, there was basically sort of a quasi salient that formed, that sort of stuck out westward towards the direction of Apollonia, but then it was contained in the north by Dardania, Thrace, and then at the bottom part of the salient, the southern portion, you have the Aetolian League, you have the Epirus's territory, and then in the Aegean, you have the Romans and her allies. They basically owned the sea. I mean, the Macedonians suffered horrible naval losses in Caria, and as well as I think it's Phocia, which is just off the coast that's on the Pergamese coast in Asia Minor. So this was just doomed from the start, just simply due to the failure of alliance building, and sometimes what we've talked about in the past of these societies that just are constantly at war. Uh, while that might look cool aesthetically, or you have this image in your head of like, oh, this conquering brave soldiers, defeating potentially more superior enemies. If your society is based on that, well, then you're just most likely eventually going to get crushed by not just one faction, but a coalition of factions. And that's basically what led up to what I would argue is this sort of quasi-salient that centralized Philip's forces near and in Cynocephalae.
Yes. So this is the decisive moment of the war, the Cynocephalae campaign. Philip mobilizes. By the way, at this point, the Macedonians are scraping the bottom of the barrel. He's recruiting young boys and retired veterans. So this is sort of like his, Berlin stand moment, where like this is his last, batch of manpower he can throw into the fight. But he has good.
Sorry, I was going to say the Macedonian Volkssturm.
There you go. But yeah, so he raised an army of 24,500 men at that point. Flamininus received reinforcements of 6,000 foot, 300 cavalry, and 3,000 marines from Italy. In the spring of that year, Flamininus and Attalus went to Thebes to negotiate the terms for the Boeotian League to join the Roman alliance. Flamininus forces their hand by sending 2,000 troops by stealth into the city of Thebes to hold them sort of hostage to sign the treaty. Attalus has a stroke. He's sent back to Pergamum and dies later that year. Flamininus marches from Elatea into Thermopylae. He was joined by Greek allies from Aetolia, Gorkton and Crete, Apollonia, and Athemania. Philip marches into Thessaly to meet the Roman-Greek army. Both sides camp near Pherae, and they are relocated to the hills near Scatusa. The Romans won a great victory at Cynocephalae. So at Cynocephalae, the Romans had 25,500 men, of which 16,000 were legionaries, 8,400 were light infantry, mostly Greeks, and then 1,800 cavalry, again, mostly Greeks, with 20 elephants, which came from Numidia. The Macedonian forces were 26,000, 16,000 phalangites, 2,000 light infantry, 5,500 mercenaries from Crete, Illyria, and Thrace, 2,000 cavalry. The Thessalian cavalry were led by Heraclides of Kirton, Macedonian cavalry by Leon, the non-Thracian mercenaries by Athenagoras, and the second infantry corps by Nicanor the elephant. So that would be like the phalangite corps, and the first corps would have been controlled by Philip. So both sides are sort of separated by a mountain range, and there's both fog and storms, which cloud their vision. And they're both marching to get to the city of Phera first, which is a sort of a place of stores. Philip does get there first, and then sends a portion of light horse and foot to take the hill of Cynocephalae. Flamininus sends his Aetolians, 2,000 foot, 500 horse, to drive them off, which they are done. That is done. And then Philip sends in his Macedonian and Thessalian horse, which drive the Aetolians from the hill. Philip was initially not willing to commit. He said the terrain was not optimal for his phalanx, which he was correct. And at this point, Nicanor his troops had been sent to forage as well, so they weren't quite ready to be deployed. But his own troops, thinking that by driving off the Aetolians from the hill, had thrown the Roman army into confusion, wanted to pursue the advantage. And so Philip, listening to them, continued the push and mobilized his main force of 8,000 phalanx to charge the Roman left. And charging downhill with the phalanx formation, he drives the Romans left down. In fact, they were handled pretty roughly throughout most of the fight. Now, at this point, Flamininus realizes if he does nothing, the Romans will probably lose. And so he marches his right to attack the Macedonian left. And at this point, Nicanor finally shows up with his phalanx marching in column, not realizing that this battle had already been unfolding in this phased way. And at this point, saying that the phalanx is not fully formed, Flamininus sends in his 20 elephants, which had the predictable effect of terrorizing and scattering the force. So at this point, the Roman right, as it's pushing forward, an unknown tribune takes off 20 maniples and then sends them back down the hill to attack the Macedonians, pressuring the Roman left. And then those Macedonians are destroyed. At this point, the Macedonians under Philip put their pikes up in the air in order as a sign of surrender. Initially, Titus doesn't know what that means, but when Philip tells him that it means that they're going to surrender, he's initially willing to accept that. But apparently the Romans who were fighting them didn't get the word in time, and presumably out of enraged battle lust, just killed them. So at the end of the battle, 8,000 Macedonians were killed, 5,000 were taken prisoner, with only 700 Roman dead. The main lessons from cynocephaly are these. One is that, as we mentioned already with Hannibal would call off a fight if it had developed without a premeditated fashion on his part. So never fight a battle that you did not intend to fight. So that was the first mistake Philip made. The second mistake Philip made was don't fight on terrain that isn't suitable for your formations, like the phalangites. And he knew it wasn't suitable for his position, but he listened to the will of his soldiers rather than the better judgment of senior commanders. In fact, partly because Nicanor was away initially scavenging for supplies. So that was the next mistake. The other thing is that the Roman formations were more tactically flexible than the Macedonians, hence the unnamed tribune's ability to shake off 20 maniples to attack the Macedonians. And then thirdly, at this point, is this was his last throw. Given that Philip didn't have any more reserves, and hence his almost immediate coming to terms with the Romans, he probably shouldn't have given battle in the first place. He probably instead should have kept his army in the field as a threat, and he already had a policy of scorched earth. Just use the policy of scorched earth he'd already lost all of his friends. He's not going to lose anymore. He should have just used scorched earth to deny the Romans supplies, and then just keep the army in the field as a threat so the Romans couldn't disperse and gather supplies. But being the case, he accepts all of Rome's terms, and the Macedonian kingdom is reduced to Macedon itself. The other thing that we see is that he suffered reverses all throughout his realm, in Achaia, Acarnania, and in Caria. So in the Peloponnesus, the Macedonian commander Androsthenes with 6,000 men marches from Corinth to pillage the Achaean cities of Pellene, Phylus, Cleone, and Sicyon. But at this point, he basically disperses his forces. And so the Achaean League under Nicostratus with 5,000 men is able to defeat the Macedonians in detail, in part because they're spread all over the place looting and pillaging. In Acarnania, and they initially delayed entry into the war, but Titus's brother Lucius launches an attack on their capital city, which after initial stiff resistance is taken by traitors. And coupling that with the news of the victory at Cynocephaly, the Acarnanian surrender. The Rhodians, with a force of 4,500 mercenaries, march into Caria to capture Rhodian Perea. The Macedonians gave battle at Abanda and were defeated. The Rhodians captured Perea, but were unable to take Stratonikia. So the peace at Tempe, Philip accepts the Roman terms. He withdraws from all of his positions outside of Macedonia, including Thessaly, is then forced to march north to fight the Dardanians. The Roman Senate votes for peace. Philip pays an indemnity of 1,000 talents, half to be paid immediately, and the rest at 10 annual investments of 50 talents. He surrendered his navy except for his flagship. His army was limited to 5,000 men. He couldn't have elephants, could not move beyond the borders of Macedonia without permission from the Roman side. In Boeotia, there was a conspiracy whereby pro-Roman politicians Zupius and Pyrrhostratus assassinated a pro-Macedonian politician, Brachyles. This led to a popular uprising which killed 500 Romans. The Romans were marching to Boeotia to punish them, but a settlement was negotiated by the Athenians and Athenian and Achaean mediation. The Aetolians were unhappy and claimed that the Romans were holding the fetters of Greece for themselves and only replacing one hegemon for another, and this would lead to in 191 BC, the Aetolian War, which is a part of a broader war with Antiochus against the Romans. And then in 196 BC, Flamininus at the Isthmian Games proclaims the freedom of the Greeks. The Romans kept garrisons in Corinth, Chalcis, and Demetrius until 194 BC. Now, one of the reasons why the harsh punishments that the Aetolians wanted to put on Macedon were not done by Titus, and why Titus was willing to negotiate with Philip, was he was afraid that Philip's forces would be joined together with Antiochus's, because Antiochus was beginning the process of invading Europe itself. And so part of it was he was playing this long game, saying that, well, we can't keep this war going for Philip to join forces with Antiochus. We can't really play for too much time because the Macedonians and the Seleucids together might be a force sufficient to challenge Rome in Greece. So at this point, we can say that Rome has achieved more or less total victory with minimal effort and is more or less prepared for the upcoming war with Antiochus.
Yeah, that's I think that's a great summary of the closing phase of the war in Cynocephali. Yeah, just a few comments about Cynocephali. What's interesting here too is that I think terrain was a really challenging factor for both armies. But as you mentioned, Philip went into the battle in sort of a really pensive and hesitant sort of way, and so like half his army with Nicanor was out, foraging for supplies, and mountainous terrain is not ideal. You want steppe terrain. You want flat fields in order to field an army. Now, I think it's fair to speculate that if Nicanor's forces had joined Philip with the right flank of the Macedonian coalition with the phalanx and the Thessalian cavalry and the peltasts, then there may have been a decent chance that they could have defeated Flamininus. However, with the combined strength of the, as you said, the tactically flexible legions, 20 elephants, with a whole other coalition of the long list that I named earlier, the writing was on the wall. This was really the last-ditch effort, and I think the terrain, and also I think there was allegedly heavy fog, at least at the beginning of the battle. There was just, this was just a last-ditch effort. Now, there was some success initially with the Macedonian phalanx pushing the Roman left flank down the field, and charging downhill has, of course, all this sort of momentum that favors the attacker running downhill. But the discipline of the legions were able to tie up the Macedonian left, and then with Nicanor was unaware of the situation just over the ridgeline, and so he makes the long march up the hill with his forces. But by that time, the Roman right was there with elephants, and there's nothing that could have been done about that, to be honest, unless there was some sort of brilliant flanking maneuver on the part of Philip. The Romans and their allies were they were just completely dominant, and by the time they sent Nicanor's forces back down the hill from being decimated, that left the Macedonian right flank open to pincer movements and basically encirclement. And so there was a great panic of running back up the ridgeline that the Macedonians had initially charged down towards the Romans, and then he basically flees, and it was a massive disaster. And I also share the hypothesis that I think the Romans in a rage frenzy just basically cut down several thousand surrendering Macedonian men from the phalanx formations. And then of course he in the political processes afterwards, he loses enormous amounts of territory to from everyone, basically Rome, Pergamum, the Seleucids, the Rhodians, and then also the Aetolian League, Epirus, and he's basically forced to be a client state of Rome at that point. And I suppose here it's interesting to ask the question, like, why weren't the Greeks more united by the time Rome became a rising hegemon in the Mediterranean? And I'm more persuaded personally by some of the historians from Osprey Publishing that this pattern of Greek infighting really became exacerbated, I think, not with the Peloponnesian War, but actually with the Diadochi War after Alexander died in his conquest, Babylon, this really set the stage for the next 2 centuries of internal Greek warfare. And this, of course, after the Romans defeat Carthage, the Romans are showing up to Attica and the Peloponnese, and it's this big, huge mess of multiple city-states and kingdoms that have been slaughtering each other for the last 2.5 centuries or so. And all Rome has to do is do a bit of diplomacy and just build themselves even just a modest coalition, and then they can go in there and clean house. And that's precisely what happened. And yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about, maybe that's perhaps the hypothesis of Greek infighting really becoming exacerbated with the Diadochi Wars. Maybe that's a bit more appropriate for a different video, but I don't know. I'm currently persuaded by that, and especially with the expansionism of Antigonus in the Diadochi Wars. But yeah, I mean, by the time Rome had successfully defeated Hannibal at Zama, well, I mean, it was all but already there was a ton of enemies before the Romans even showed up. There, Macedonia had tons. The Aetolian League, Athens, Sparta, all of Asia Minor, basically, with a handful of exceptions like some city-states, Thrace, the Dardanians, Apollonia. They were just surrounded, and it was just bad politicking on the part of Philip. And it's hard to speculate on what he should have done, but yeah, you probably shouldn't brutalize these populations of people that you conquer to start off with. But yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, yeah. So what I'll end with is a sort of summary of I think the big points from this conflict. One is that Rome could fight another war so soon after Hannibal shows you how powerful the Roman state was. Rome had already suffered hundreds of thousands of dead at the hands of Hannibal. And what do? Like a year after the war ends, they fight the Macedonians. It's like they don't skip a beat. Like there's something there that shows you that how strong the Roman state is, and its manpower reserves to fight. And of course, many of these troops were probably children during the war with Hannibal and have now since grown up. The fact that there has to be reference to the mutiny of the veterans indicates that, well, maybe a lot of these newer troops were actually youths in the war with Hannibal and are now old enough to fight. Whereas by Cynocephaly, the Macedonians are running out of manpower. So we see the difference here. Yeah, because basically by the time of Hannibal, as Polybius points out, Rome has for all practical purposes, unlimited manpower reserves. So in that regard, we can see, that Macedon had no chance at this point, really, especially given all of its diplomatic blunders. Second of all, we see that from the Roman point of view, control of the sea was maintained just as in the last war, and just as in the Second Punic War was crucial for victory. Since they could threaten and attack the Macedonians anywhere, whereas the Macedonians, otherwise, they would have had the advantage of interior lines, was in some sense negated by Roman control of the sea, as well as Roman diplomatic prowess, able to, again, get the Aetolians and Achaeans to actually work together, to get the Achaeans to break their alliance with Philip. The Romans skillfully were able to pry away Philip's limited alliance structure and keep him diplomatically isolated, but also were intelligent enough to not continue the war unnecessarily, driving him into the arms of Antiochus. So we see that. We see that also at the Battle of Cynocephaly itself. The mistake that Philip made was fighting a battle he did not premeditate. He did not intend to fight by bringing about himself. It was an accident that developed into a battle. That was a mistake. Fighting on ground not suitable for the phalanx was also a mistake. Fighting without his entire army mobilized was a mistake. I mean, Philip just made every conceivable mistake. Strategically, politically, militarily. I mean, there was really no chance Philip was going to win this fight. Philip just did everything wrong. And the Romans, again, were able to bring. They were also able to win the diplomatic game, especially with the declaration of the Isthmian Games that Flamininus had made. And so what we see here, though, clearly is the beginning of a trend which we'll observe for the next 150 years of the Macedonian art of war being completely inadequate to the new conditions that Rome brings upon it. Early on, when we had the sort of refined Macedonian way of war under Pyrrhus, a commander not seen since Alexander the Great. With the full panoply of war, including elephants, even Rome in its infancy, relative infancy, was able to finally defeat him. How much less would Philip V be able to do this? But even more powerful kings like Antiochus, who gets defeated at Magnesia in 189 BC, or Mithridates of Pontus, or others who continue this Macedonian tradition, are just completely outclassed by the Romans. And that question we can explore later on as we deal with these conflicts. But I think those are the big takeaway items. Final thoughts.
Right. Well, I think the only items that I can add to that is this, we're starting to see more here in antiquity that efficient, well-designed systems beat out cult of personalities. Now, you can go back several centuries earlier where you have successful conquerors that just simply subjugate populations across Europe and the Mediterranean, and if you dare act out, you'll be put to death. But typically, those types of empires and factions only last so long because, back to our sort of repeated analogy of the Persian conscript. If you really have no say or no social mobility or any opportunities to speak of in the empire that you live in, then you're not going to have any sort of foundational loyalties or any hopes for the future or anything like that. And so I know that with Macedon, it's with Philip, it's a different case, but here you have a very impulsive and barbaric Macedonia, just trying to seize all it can before the Romans and her allies close in. And it was just a hopeless from the beginning, just due to the failed results of the Cretan War, and Philip was already enemies with the Ptolemaic dynasty, and Antiochus, held territory from central Iran all the way into Western Asia, the western portions of Asia Minor, right next to Pergamon and the Rhodians and Pontus. And so it was easy for the Romans to just form a coalition and go in and smash Philip. And of course, we'll see there's two other historical examples of the Third and Fourth Macedonian Wars, that the Macedonians aren't done yet, apparently. But one other point that you made that I think is a great point is that I personally think that Rome probably put in a tenth of the effort that they put in at the Punic War in conquering Philip's territory and his armies. I mean, all they had to do was just take advantage of the chaos of the Peloponnese and Attica, and it was a cakewalk for Rome for the most part, other than having a bit of a changing of hands of commanders. And also Rome did, interestingly enough, suffer a mutiny of about 2,000 veterans near Apollonia after their landing, because they were so exhausted from war, from the Second Punic War. But that was ironed out in several months, apparently, before the battle of the river battle, which apparently I just can't stop forgetting, the Ouse River. I think it was the Ouse River, yes. So anyways, I'll leave my last comments at that, and thanks as always for having me.
Always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.